Best.
Welcome to Fully Exposed, a podcast that explores the taboo and unconventional in an attempt to educate your ass. I'm your host, Jessica Beuker. Let's get started. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Fully Exposed. Today I am here with our guest, Katelyn Roberts. She is a sexological body worker, feminist porn maker, founder of Body Pride. Welcome, Katelyn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So you are an incredibly interesting person with a lot of different plates spinning. So why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Just in like a general, like all of the things
in a general
that I
sense. I know there's a lot. I know there's a lot there to go off of, but yeah, just I guess like a brief overview.
Sure. I think like probably the best way to describe how I exist in the world and the work that I do is like this really strong conviction to remove shame from sexuality. And like that shows up in a variety of different ways that can appear to be extremely radical to some people. Starting with the Body Pride workshops that I started when I was like in my early 20s, which were just naked workshops for people. And then I started creating an ethical feminist porn company in Toronto and running like queer party nights. And that kind of rolled into becoming a certified sex educator and then a certified somatic sex educator and then a surrogate partner. So I'm like currently involved in like a number of different projects and activities that are all pretty radical, but all based around this like removal of shame from sexual well-being.
Right. Okay. Wow. You summed that up very well. For the sake of keeping it chronological, I want to start by talking about Body Pride before moving on to your current career path. So can you tell us exactly what Body Pride is and how you got started with that?
Yeah, totally. So Body Pride came about from me watching Betty Dodson's body sex workshop documentary. And I was, I think, 21 at the time. I had just moved out of my family home into my very first apartment and sitting down and like trying to get educated around sex education because I didn't really know how I could become like a real sex educator. And one of the things I found was Betty Dodson's material. And I think the thing that struck me probably most intensely when I was watching it wasn't like the group masturbation or the genital show and tell or like the body work they were doing. It was like the fact that there was just like 10 women just casually naked together. And like that just like blew my mind as a young woman that like that was possible, that you could just be naked without it being related to like showering or health or sex.
Right.
And it like instigated in me a really like deep realization that I wanted to just be comfortable with my body. And so I didn't start my own body sex workshops. I didn't feel quite prepared for that, but I did a kind of like, I can work with this naked thing. I've got a naked body and I can definitely talk about it. So I asked like a group of friends if they would just like entertain this idea and like hang out with me naked for a night. And it was just like incredible. The feedback of like, I didn't know this was possible. Like this served me so much better therapeutically than like years of like intense counseling around eating disorders. I was just like overwhelmed by the feedback as like a young woman kind of stepping into the world of sex education, maybe, that I just kept doing them and people kept coming. So that's how that started. And there's a naked photo shoot at the end. That like summarizes what Body Pride is.
So obviously you mentioned that there was like a lot of positive feedback about body pride. I've personally heard a lot of positive feedback about it. However, as with anything, I'm sure there's also the flip side where people sort of just see it as like a bunch of hippies hanging out and getting naked, or an orgy, or something that's like completely sexual. So I'm curious to that, how you, I guess, convey to those people that body pride is so much more, I guess, how you deal with that backlash.
That's like a really interesting point. And I think there's, again, that comes up a lot around like this fear of sexuality. I started running them primarily just for cis women, because I am a cis woman, and I was like, this is my target audience. And then I had this like lingering feedback in the back of my head that was like, but why not men? Like, what's the reason that I wouldn't invite men into this space? And it was this like idea that it would be turned into like a sexual thing when it wasn't necessarily sexual. It was just about naked bodies. And I didn't actually believe that. I didn't think that, like, if we said the purpose of this event is not to engage sexually or to flirt or to like have sex or hook up, it's just to talk and be naked. And if arousal happens because you're seeing naked bodies, like, that's cool. Just like, don't do anything about it in that moment. Like, just accept what's happening in your body and move along. Like, the benefit we have as women is that you can't really see our arousal. So with men, like, the ability to like witness and view someone's arousal, I was like really interested in being able to hold that space and take away the shame around it. Right? Like, it's fine to be aroused. Like, that's okay. Yeah. That's totally perfectly fine. Like, we're just normal sexual human beings. And like, arousal happens, and like, you're around a bunch of naked bodies, it makes sense that some arousal is happening. So just like setting a container at the beginning and being really clear in advertisements that it wasn't a sex party or an orgy, or necessary. I mean, like, I don't know if I'm a hippie. Just like really specifically, this is what's going to happen. And if you agree to come, then you're agreeing to the container that you're coming into.
Right. I think those types of very community driven type of events also really function a lot on like word of mouth. So if somebody goes and has a positive experience, which, was the case for everyone that, I've heard of going, then they're going to pass that on and tell their friends. And then it kind of becomes this buzz in the community where then people can then educate maybe people who don't understand what it is or who have questions. And then again, it's just like that passing down of knowledge and that education. Do you still currently run any sessions?
Body Pride specifically, I haven't. I was doing, my last one was in Toronto in September at Good for Her, and I am more than happy to run them. I've just, I've exhausted myself with event advertising. So if someone decides to hire me to facilitate one, I am more than happy to do so. I just don't want to go looking to find the people to fill it.
Yeah. That's fair.
Yeah.
Moving on from Body Pride, I want to talk a little bit about what it is you currently do. So correct me if I'm wrong, but your current title is sexological body worker. Is that like the name of the work that you do, or is there a different term for it?
So I call myself a somatic sex educator, and I am a trained sexological body worker.
Okay.
It's just the training for sexological bodywork has kind of transitioned more into somatic sex education. So there's more understanding of like internal bodywork going on, the nervous system response, trauma, a lot of science behind it. So it's like taking all these aspects from like physiology and trauma and sex education and combining them into sexological bodywork as well, which is touch work.
Okay. So can you, I guess we'll talk a little bit about both, but from a sexological body worker perspective, can you explain exactly what that entails?
Can I explain what somatic sex education is instead? I think that that's probably
Sure.
better.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
um, somatic means the body, like the living body. When we bring in to the conversation of sexuality, this concept of the body as the experiencer of sexuality, it starts to broaden that horizon by like a whack load. And like this
Hmm.
is really, really an important detail where, like, in regards to consent, this is a really good example where you're in a situation and maybe like someone asks if you want to come home with them. And, in your head, you might be like, well, we've already had a 3-hour date and like it was pretty good. And like, I don't know if I'm ready to go home yet. And like, I don't know, maybe it's just easier to say yes than no. So like all these things in our head are coming up as like things to weigh out and balance. Whereas our gut actually is responsible for 90% of the information that goes to our brain. And we're not really
Hmm.
tapped into that information. So, what happens when we start to pay attention to what our bodies are telling us is that we're able to navigate consent in a really clear and congruent way. So, if I were to like ask you, hey, Jeff, could I shave your head? And you might have like a really somatic response in your body of like, fuck no, right? Like, there's no
Yeah.
way in hell that's happening. And like beginning to tap into like, okay, that was a really strong no. What did that feel like in my body? Because our bodies are giving us so much information, and it's the practice of learning to listen to them. So, in regards to
Right.
sexuality, what happens with trauma specifically, and we're used to thinking of trauma as like pretty wide scale, like natural disasters and like medical illnesses or violence, and trauma happens at like a micro level to us all every day when we go into
Hmm.
like appeasing someone else or deciding to do something that we don't really want to do but like we'll do anyway. Just like little tiny things that kind of pile up, like working against what our body is actually telling us. So, this really interesting thing happens with trauma is that whenever we have this experience of trauma, it causes us to be disembodied. And when we're disembodied, it means that we don't feel safe in our bodies. And when we don't feel safe in our bodies, we can't feel our bodies. So somatic sex education kind of like invites people back into the body using pleasure as a tool to like remind ourselves like, hey, this body actually feels like pretty fucking great most of the time. Like our skin is just like one giant nerve ending that's super sensitive to everything that touches it. Like the sun
Hmm.
shining on our skin is beautiful. Like sex feels amazing. And like these are the reasons why in my body specifically, and how do I get those sensations to happen. So it's like a really interesting an invitation to come back into the body's experience of what pleasure is.
Wow. So
Does that make sense?
it totally made
Great.
sense. I'm blown away by all of it. I feel like too, going back to the consent thing is really interesting because my assumption would be that, I mean, when you ask somebody a question like, can I shave your head? Exactly. If you ask me that, my answer would exactly be fuck no. So it's sort of, we have those almost extreme reactions to things like that. But when it comes to like sex and relationships, I feel like that's a little bit hazier. And I feel like that happens to be with how we've been socialized, and
Mm-hmm.
especially as women, to be polite
Mm-hmm.
and, to not say no
Yeah.
and so it's really interesting to me that, if you ask somebody the shave your head question, yeah, my body does have more of sort of an adverse reaction than if somebody asks me to come home with them at the end of the night. It's almost like I don't understand
Right.
my reaction
Yeah.
because for so long I've been taught to not understand it.
Right. To ignore it, to just like go along with the situation as you have been instructed to by society and culture around you. Right.
Hmm.
So this like, and this is a really interesting piece. You can go onto Betty Martin's website. She's conducted this like magnificent like it's called the Wheel of Consent, which is this fabulous tool for understanding like specifically all touch interactions, but literally all interactions in general, where in these two quadrants. I'm going to go into this just briefly because it's interesting about consent.
Sure.
So there's 4 quadrants in general. The first 2 that are really easy to understand are serving and accepting. So in regards to consent, when you're doing someone a service, like you are both the action, you're doing the action of serving them. Like, let's use oral sex, for example. So if someone's like, would you go down on me? Great. I can fulfill this service. I can do the action and give you this gift, right? Where it gets a little hazier is in these other 2 factors, which is taking and allowing. So the difference between someone going down on me for my pleasure versus someone going down on me for their pleasure.
Ooh.
Yes, right? This is where it gets really interesting because it asks the question, who is it for? Is it for me or is it for the person going down on me? And that's where it gets really, really sticky, is because a lot of people don't know who it's for. And when you try and clarify that, it can get kind of like really interesting, first of all, because there's a lot of stuff that comes up for both parties because like, oh, if it's for me, then I actually have to like direct the situation. Like I have to be like, oh no, that's not quite working. Would you do it this way instead? And like, oh, not just a little softer, maybe a little, oh, faster there. Yes. And like, if it's for me, like it's going to be fucking for me. So like, let's make this situation the gift that I want to get. But if it's for the other person, then I have to be in the allowing quadrant. Me as the person who is going down on, who is receiving the oral sex for the other person's pleasure, I just get to like sit back and let the other person do what they want for their pleasure, as long as like everything feels okay and like everything is like congruent in myself. Like I don't see anything wrong with just like laying back and letting someone go down on me purely for their pleasure. Like, sure, sign me up. Yes, please. But there's that question, who is it for? Doesn't come up a lot in sexual interactions. And as people who are socialized female, just growing up, we've been so socialized to just tolerate and endure that, unfortunately, and this is a huge part of the Me Too conversation, is that when we're enduring and tolerating, there's this like in the back of our heads, even though like we might be engaged in a consensual thing, like, yeah, I signed up to have sex with this person and like it kind of hurts a little bit, but like we're almost done, so I'll just like continue a bit. But when that starts to happen, when we're starting to like notice that it's not great for us anymore, we're starting to view our partners as someone who's causing us that endurance and toleration, which is not something that we really want to be doing in like an intimate encounter. So there's a lot that comes up around like even noticing in your body, like, oh, I don't want this to happen anymore. And then finding the ability to actually say it, which is like a whole other can of worms.
Totally. Yeah. I find that very interesting. Thank you for explaining that wheel. I think it's, it's interesting to think about, kind of what comes out of our mouths and what our bodies are telling us in our minds, and how those very often clash with one another. So essentially I'm starting to kind of understand that the work that you do is essentially trying to bridge that disconnect between those two. Because I mean, the body and the mind are very related. It's just, we kind of think of them almost as two separate things, as opposed to everything's all just in one vessel. Can you walk us through like a typical day in the office? So like how you've now kind of explained what somatic sex education is. Where is your role in all of this? So what exactly do you do?
So people might come to a somatic sex educator for a variety of different reasons. It might be physical. Someone might have erectile dysfunction or vaginismus, or maybe they've gone through some sort of surgical intervention and they're trying to figure out how to come back into pleasure in the body. It could be for relationship reasons, if they're undergoing some like relationship stress and want to figure out how to bring some boundaries and communication into that relationship. It could be for trauma, like learning to move through trauma in the body through touch. And that's a really interesting one too, because trauma lives in the body. Trauma doesn't understand that time has passed. And when we get triggered, our entire bodies go back into that moment that we were experiencing that trauma. So really specifically, when someone's undergone some form of like sexual assault, that trauma may live in their pelvic regions or their anus or their genitals. And there are no professional resources out there that can help mitigate that gap for somebody. So it's like a really powerful tool for someone to come in, be lying on the table, and be able to direct the practitioner's touch, like to the T. Like, I am not going to touch you unless you give me specific details of how you want to be touched, for how long you want to be touched, in what kind of scenario, like, it is okay for you to be touched. Like, that container, you're safe here, you're in control. Let's rewire your nervous system so that this touch on your genitals or your anus or in your pelvic bowl starts to be understood as safe instead of triggering. Yeah. So those are like a handful of different reasons. Shame is a huge one too. If someone has porn compulsion, like undoing these things that are like culturally ingrained in us from a really young age and starting to move through them to come out and like shine as a sexual star in the sky.
So do you have then repeat clients? Like, do you have people that come quite often, or do you have, is it like, do people come for one session and then never come back? Or what is, I guess, more common, or is it a mixed bag?
So, like, I usually recommend that 5 sessions is a really good place to start with, just because working with the body and the nervous system, titration is really important. So little bit by little bit. So instead of someone handing over a Viagra to someone who's experiencing ED, we're taking the body and being like, okay, let's start to like remap pleasure a bit. Let's start to undo some of the performance anxiety that's happening for you. Let's start to work with your own masturbation practices. So this like process of like really learning your body and practicing pleasure in your body in ways that you're not used to does take some time. So I do assign homework. It's masturbation homework, but like you're gonna.
That sounds like fun homework.
I know, right? It can actually be really frustrating, but that's like a whole different topic. And so yes, the titration of like slowly, especially the nervous system too. So people who do have a lot of trauma, it's really important for their nervous systems to feel safe, and then move into touch work or interaction or like noticing what's coming up for them and then coming down again. So learning how to regulate the nervous system is training your body to learn how to be more regulated, just like whenever you need to tap into that resource.
Right. What would you say your work means to you on a personal level?
Oh my God. What a great question. So I have this video on YouTube so for the part of the training, my Somatic Sex Educator training, we had to do 30 days of mindful masturbation. And so they gave us like a list of different things that we had to include in this practice, this 30 minutes every day for 30 days. And it had to include like an intention, some movement, some sound, some breath work, some kegels, like a whole onslaught of different things. And it was basically just an invitation to explore your body as an adult that we never really got as kids. We kind of just like figure it out how to do it in the dark. And like masturbation for me didn't come easily at all. Like I remember being 15 and I was like, okay, I got to figure this one out. Like if I want to be able to have pleasure with partners, I got to figure out how to do it by myself first. And I remember like Googling how to masturbate. And one of the things that came up was like, take a string of pearls and rub them between your labia. And I'm like, okay, sure. And so I had like cheap dollar store pearls and I was like rubbing blue, so it was like really dry and awkward. Like that didn't work at all. And eventually I figured the whole process out. I found like the use of the shower head and the bathtub, and then eventually I figured out how to use my fingers. Like it was a whole process of just like figuring out how to find pleasure in my body. But once I found it, I didn't change that process at all. It was like, oh, great, I found the thing that works for me. So I'll just do that a bunch of times over and over and over and over again. But the thing is, and this is like the really cool part, is that we don't really talk about like the neurological and scientific reasons behind all of the sexual stuff, which is that the neurons that fire together wire together. So literally training my body to experience pleasure in this one really specific way. And like, that's how my body understood to reach orgasm. So this process of like undoing that pattern specifically and figuring out how to move into pleasure in a way that like was so all encompassing of like, okay, I'm wearing this sweater. And like, when I move my arm, I can like feel the pleasure of the fabric moving against my arm, and like noticing the wind on my face as like an enjoyable sensation. Like all of these little tools to like notice pleasure is like massively life altering. Just in terms of like my own ability to like regulate myself and my nervous system and moving towards like a pleasure framework for life instead of this fear-based, what's the word I'm looking for? Scarcity. That's the word. Like, there's just not enough. Like, how to get more pleasure, how to like, eat the food I want to eat, get some orgasms in there, like maybe drink or smoke a little, like, just like seeking out these pleasurable experiences without ever really feeling fulfilled.
When you were young, did you ever imagine yourself doing a job like this? I'm curious how this work became important to you, essentially, like how your experiences as a young person, as a child, as a teenager kind of led to this being something that you were like, okay, this is the work that I need to be doing as an adult.
It's so funny. Once I finished the training in the summer, I had a moment where I was like talking to a friend. It's like, this is what I wanted to be when I grew up, but I had no idea it existed. Like, if someone had told
That's
me
amazing.
this was a job, I would have been like, yes, that one, please. But like, I had no clue. So I remember these really clear instances when I was young that weren't sexual. They weren't genitally related, but like watching my cousin focus really intently on braiding like my sister's hair, I just like had this like really deep feeling of like pleasure in my body. It was like, so my heart was just like whoosh all over my chest, and like it just felt so good, and it wasn't sexual at all. And like that's the part that I think that I was trying to figure out, was like, how do we bring joy and pleasure into our bodies without necessarily needing to rely on these external resources? So I was just particularly interested in like touch as a young person. And as, you know, hormones and puberty come into existence, like a young child who's interested in touch is probably going to start having sex pretty quickly. And as soon as that happened for me, I just started noticing like how much wasn't being shared with young people or anyone about like sexuality related issues. Like I didn't, just like the whole virginity thing. Like when I lost my virginity, I was like, that was anticlimactic. Like I don't feel like a woman. Why does everyone make such a big deal out of this? Like just like little things overlapping each other that I was just like, no one's talking about this. There's just all this quietness and shame and guilt and fear about everything. And that was coming up in my family, where I really like, I wanted to have alone time with my boyfriend in my basement apartment at 17. And my mother was like, you can't have sex in the house. And I was like, well, where else am I going to do it? In the park? And like, that's what wound up happening because I'm 17 and horny. So like, just finding the tools and resources to like be able to have conversations with my family then kind of kept pushing me in the direction of like wanting more. I wanted to be able to explain why this was important when I felt it was important in my body to move into pleasure. And sex is a pretty intense pleasure. And yet there's all this fear around it. So like really, really, I feel very grounded in the decision to become a somatic sex educator because it's literally just given me a bunch of science as to why touch and pleasure are really fucking good for us.
The stuff you mentioned about like your family and your friends actually leads really nicely into my next question, which is how you go about facilitating these types of discussions in the public sphere. So, I mean, your friends and family is one side of that, obviously, but also the other side of that is just like the general public. You know, like when your barista casually asks you what you do, you know, are you able to be open about it without having to necessarily, I guess, feel like you have to get into like a 1 hour explanation? Like how do those kind of conversations work and how do you facilitate them and balance them within the public?
Yeah. You definitely tapped into a truth there. It's not ever just, the conversation doesn't usually just end once I answer that question. There's usually something there. It's not like I'm an accountant and that's it. It's like, oh, I'm a somatic sex educator. What? Like, what does that even mean? And actually, that's one of the reasons why I love using the word somatic, because people are like, I don't understand. Tell me more. I'm like, great, let me. So, yeah, it's definitely been a practice. And, you know, that whole thing about like, do what you love. It never feels like a chore or a burden to have this conversation with someone new, because I feel I've been given a really powerful gift of being able to remove my own shame around sexuality, that to be able to hold that space for another person, I'm just like, yeah, let it out. Like, give me all of your shame so you can walk out of here feeling lighter.
Yeah. What was or is the most surprising thing that you've learned in the last year doing the work that you do?
Like, it's been it's like almost like it's really vulnerable for me to even say this, and I feel like it's so important that it gave me such a strong sense of like understanding like the human experience and being alive and being here in this body on this planet going through this experience, and like what I want to do with that and how do I want to exist here, and like how can I make the most out of this experience for myself regardless of my external realities. So like a really, really fucking powerful relationship to spirituality.
Wow.
Yeah.
And was that something that like specifically stemmed from this work? That wasn't something that you had growing up or before? That was...
You know, it's really interesting. My mother was pretty like, she gave us, me and my sister, a lot of the language around spirituality, but it was like a beautiful idea for me. It was like, oh, wouldn't that be nice if these things were true? And like, I really wanted to believe in a lot of it, but like, I couldn't understand how I could like genuinely know it as truth. And when I started becoming more embodied, when I started like feeling the subtleties of like my fingernail or like my belly button or like my heart space, just like walking through the day, like just all these really internal sensations that I hadn't been noticing before. Truth becomes really fucking clear in the body. And when you read something or hear something, you can like, you know it as truth in your body. And like that was what I was looking for. Was how do
Wow.
it's like a navigation system. Our bodies are navigation systems for this world. And we're like the entire capitalist structure and industry is just telling us that our heads are how we're navigating the world. And it's backwards. Like our heads and our
Yeah.
minds are a beautiful tool for us to communicate and exist and do work. And like our bodies are the things that we're living in. We're living in these bodies and we're ignoring them most of the time.
Yeah.
And there's just
Wow.
like so much truth in them. It's like pretty fucking incredible.
That's very amazing. um, to go, I guess, to the opposite end of that, what would you say, if there are any, are some of the difficult aspects of the work that you do?
I would say probably the most difficult is the accessibility factor. There's this concept that pleasure is a birthright. And that's like a really nice thought and concept. And like, it is true that every body is born with the innate capacity to feel pleasure. And that is not the same as learning how to expand that capacity for pleasure. We're hardwired, like just how we've evolved as humans on planet Earth. We've been chased by tigers. There's been like natural disasters that we weren't prepared for. We had medical issues come up that our healthcare system wasn't ready for. So our nervous systems served us to be hyper alert so that we could survive. And now we're moving out of just surviving, which is really interesting. Like there's this new book called Homo Deus, which is talking about like the trajectory of the human experience of like war is becoming obsolete. It's more likely that you'll commit suicide than like be murdered by another human. Famine is also on its way out. You're more likely to die of obesity than starvation. So there's just like, we're moving out of survival and we're moving into a new space where our nervous systems are no longer serving us to be on such high alert for all the negative things happening in our environment. So we're born into this world with all this intergenerational trauma that we're carrying in our DNA. And it's now we have available on the table an opportunity to start shifting that negativity bias towards like, oh, we can start like being in pleasure without being in fear that we need to survive, that we're going to die. So it's like, there was a point here. What was the initial question? What did I
what the, I guess, difficulties or challenges are in your work?
Yes. So there's the trauma that I have a lot of privilege as like a cis white woman living in Canada. Like there's a lot of privilege there, and that privilege has given me so many tools and availabilities to even learn that coming into pleasure is a thing. Like I had the means to financially go to like weird sex schools and like learn weird sex techniques and find out all this interesting new neuroscience that it is related to sexuality and pleasure. And like those tools aren't available to everybody. I barely knew they even existed until I went to do them. So right now I'm sitting with this interesting task of like all this information, all this knowledge about how beneficial it is to come into pleasure biologically, mind, body, spirituality, like all of the things. Like pleasure is what's going to lead us there. As humans, we're just constantly pulled into it. And it's like a tool of learning how to build on that capacity. And it's really quite simple. Like, you don't need anything other than your body and noticing your body, which is great and excellent. And how do we get that information out there so that people don't have to pay $150 to come to a session with a somatic sex educator in order to become more embodied and in their pleasure? Like, how do we make this information accessible to everybody so that regardless of your class or your race or your position in the world, you have the tools to regulate yourself and come into pleasure?
It's interesting because that's usually, when I talk about issues such as this, basically any topic that has an issue or is controversial or has, kind of two sides. When I'm having these discussions, I always end kind of with asking people, like, how can people know more? How can they learn more? How can they get the tools and the resources and the education that's available? So it's I mean, you just answered that. That's your everyday challenge as well. So obviously that means that if you as somebody who does it is still struggling to be able to get that information out to people who aren't as in as privileged of a position as you or I, that obviously there's still a lot of work to do there, which I think is you can look at that from a positive light though as well, in being that there's work to do, which means now that we have people kind of moving into that industry and taking the courses that you take, those will be kind of the people that are going to figure out how to fix that problem.
Yeah. Totally.
To end off, where can people get in touch with you if they're interested in learning more or becoming a client or talking to you more about this?
At my website, which is KatelynKRoberts.com.
And there were a couple resources that you had mentioned throughout the conversation that I'll also try to throw up kind of links in the show notes. So if people are interested, please go there. This is a super interesting topic that I could honestly go on about all day. And I feel like it's also it's one of those topics too that it's like a conversation that doesn't have an end. Which is very interesting. So I think people just need to have these conversations more. And maybe if they learn something that they thought was interesting, then don't be afraid to bring that up in your own friend group and facilitate the discussions that way.
So can I just plug a couple of the projects that I'm working on right now?
Of course.
They're pretty interesting.
Yes, please.
So one of them is called Lilith Bay, which is trauma training for sex workers. So one of the ways that we're hoping to start making the work more accessible is by offering 3-day mini workshops to sex workers. So people who are already in the sex industry, people who are already touching genitals and like working intimately with men, specifically men, to give them tools to help their clients move through trauma if it were to come up. So that's like really awesome. We're doing that all over Canada over the next following year or so. And I'm doing that with a trauma therapist who's so wonderfully entered into this world, really like gracefully and beautifully.
Amazing.
Another project is the Apollo Project, which is retreats for men that are all about sexuality healing and becoming more embodied. So like really luxurious West Coast experience in like beautiful lodge, and then receiving body work every day and having men's circles and talking about their experience to undo a lot of like the cultural ideas of what it is to be a man and how to be a man in sexuality and move into pleasure in a really authentic way. And the last one is I'm working on a Somatic Sex Educator app. So it's like, this is such a random, new and exciting field, a professional field. And we're developing an app to connect clients to practitioners all over the world. So if you're like, hey, a lot of what you mentioned is relevant to me, you could go onto this app and find a practitioner in your area and start working one-on-one with them. And that's called Happy Touch.
Oh, that sounds Happy Touch. That sounds very handy to have.
Yeah.
Amazing. I actually do have another question
Great.
that you kind of reminded me as you were talking. Is there, I mean, obviously everybody's, we're all like a thumbprint. Everybody's individual experiences are going to differ completely. But do you find that that there's like a kind of a distinct difference in the types, I guess, of reasons that you get, like women coming to you and men coming to you? Because I mean, within society, there's the two very kind of distinct sides of the way that women and men are supposed to experience sexuality. And that starts at a super, super, super young age, even just from something as little as like, this is very absurd, but like when I was in high school, it was like unheard of for women to talk about masturbation. And like if a guy asked you if you did that, most girls would be like, oh no, like never. And if there was like the one person that did say yes, it was like very shocking. And they were like, what? Women do that? So there's always just in the ways that we're allowed to kind of experience sexual pleasure, what we're supposed to oppress. I feel like that would differ a lot in the reasons that you would get like someone who identifies as a woman coming to you, someone who identifies as a man coming to you.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, absolutely. I use socialized male and female because I do work with a lot of non-binary and queer and trans people. And usually there is some form of like socialization with either one of those things. So people who have been socialized male, there is an overwhelming amount of fear around their desire. They are so scared of what they want and hurting someone with what they want. And generally, and there are facts around this now, that like the reality of anyone actually hurting someone with their sexual desires is not realistic. It's just this fear around taking, that quadrant of taking and allowing, of I want to go down on you for my pleasure, being so scared of my pleasure that they can't even tap into it. They can't even go into their pleasure because they're scared that they will become the assaulter or someone who is pushing their partner into enduring or tolerating. And they so badly don't want to do that, so that they've repressed all of their desire. So holding space for men to just be genuinely in their authentic desire without fear, without like making them feel like they're doing me a disservice or a harm, to be able to hold them and like, hey, that's really beautiful and wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with me, and continue to hold that container really firmly, was like a really beautiful and so astoundingly like grateful in my body to learn that in my surrogacy training, was just to like be able to accept male desire without becoming triggered by it, was like really, really important for me in this work. For people who are socialized female, what's really distinct is the enduring and tolerating aspect of allowing. So we usually have men up and taking, people are socialized male up and taking, and people are socialized female down and allowing, and being in like the shadow realms of both of those things. So learning as someone who's socialized female, it's like, shit, I've been enduring a lot in my life, and like I haven't been saying anything. Like that's on me. And so that's like a really intense realization for a lot of people who are socialized female to like come in, know that about themselves, and then try and figure out how to move back into pleasurable allowing, how to speak up for their bodies and for themselves, to find that congruency of like, oh yeah, okay, this feels good again. So being those two quadrants, the taking and allowing, are like pretty intense in terms of like socialized male, socialized female. And like it varies. Trauma has a lot to do with it on both parts of that, like depending on someone's trauma history.
Well, thank you very much. This conversation has been incredibly enlightening, as any of my conversations have always been with you. So
can I ask you a question?
Yes. Ooh, this is fun.
What was the most interesting part to you? Like what was like something that you learned today? What are you going to take away?
What is my takeaway? I think that my biggest takeaway was probably, And it's weird because it's not, when you said it, it didn't feel like it was new information. It felt like it was like something that I had known for so long, but was only hearing for the first time. So the bit when you talked about consent and you first talked about that wheel and that taking and allowing, I think it's really refreshing and interesting to hear out loud just how often our bodies say something, but we still go along with it, even though our bodies are trying to like tell us no. So like I think in my life, I can recall plenty of times that I've done that. And so it's really interesting to just hear that that's not, it's a very common thing. But also that it's a very, like you said, like psychological, like neurological thing. Like it's very kind of, there's a reason for it, and that, you know, you're not just kind of a weird person for doing that. It's like, it's something that is ingrained and common among a lot of people. I think hearing that like out loud was something that's very interesting, and hopefully when you start to kind of hear these truths that I guess maybe you've known but haven't been aware of, then you can start being now maybe that is floating in my head so freshly. I will hopefully be more aware of it when I go to, you know, have encounters with other people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely.
So that was a big one.
It's really hard to ignore the truth once you know it.
Yeah.
It's like, shit, now I have to
to do it. Yeah. So I thought that was very interesting. The other thing I'd say, the most shocking thing was just the last thing you said about men coming to you and their thing being, or sorry, people who've been socialized as men, their thing being that they carry like a lot of like fear. I guess I wouldn't have assumed that, just because we do, like, I mean, you just hear so many instances of, you know, sexual assault and things like that. And so I guess a lot of times the assumption could be made, and it's a complete unfair assumption, but the assumption could be made that, you know, men are just walking around always going after their pleasure and disregarding how women feel or how other people feel, whoever they're engaging with, right? So I think that a lot of people probably have that assumption. So to hear that that's not necessarily true, that that's like a very huge, broad generalization, is really refreshing and interesting, because I always like to know that, you know, there are two sides. I think in society too often we always get into this mindset of seeing in sexual relationships men as the oppressors and women as the oppressed, and that's not true, right? So and there are issues that men are working through as well. So I thought that part was like really interesting as well.
Yeah, and like the whole conversation around Me Too is so important, and like that recognition of that anger from like half the population of being like, no, my autonomy, my sexual autonomy is just as important to yours. And it's also really, really important to recognize that people who have been socialized male are, and like, it's so interesting to me now because I'm living with like 2 young children right now, and we're watching all these like movies, just like way more movies than I probably have ever watched in any portion of my life. And all these messages that are coming through of these movies about how men should act and how women should act. And in all of these movies, men are taking for their pleasure all over the place. Yeah. And they're being taught that that's how you be a man, is that you take your pleasure. And that's what women like, is for that to be taken. So don't worry about it. Just, you know, do it and it'll be fine. And yet there's no education happening there about like what's going on in that interaction. Where's the consent that's happening there? So it's just, I really just to acknowledge that like we're first socially conditioning men to fill this role and then getting angry at them for fulfilling it. So it's like, it's just this like massive cultural and social story that's being told that each individual person is having their own experience with. Like, I've been in situations where I've been the person who's been violating another person, and I had no clue until afterwards. Right? Like, I think that I'm fulfilling this role. I'm doing this in a certain way. I think that they're into it. And then afterwards, it's like, I didn't want that to happen. It's like, fuck, shit, I'm so sorry. Like, I'm genuinely so sorry. And how do I do better?
Right.
Right? So a lot of men are coming into that realization of like, this story isn't working because it's hurting people, and I don't want to hurt people. And that's actually true in like the overall, like, sexual assault and rape have gone down over the past 10 years, like, and they continue to go down. So as like a general rule, our societies are like becoming more consensual, which is great.
Yeah. Which is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Again, it's that like sandwich in the middle, just what you said of here is what people are being socialized to be. They're socialized to be the taker. They're socialized to just, go after their own pleasure regardless of any consequences or and that might go against, but we don't often consider that often probably goes against how a lot of men actually feel and want to behave. But again, there's that fear of, oh, I can't break out of this box. This is how I'm supposed to act. This is how I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
So then they do. And then we turn around and go, oh, that's bad. So
Yeah.
but then they're constantly being bombarded with, oh, that's good. That I never really considered exactly how confusing those and how mixed those messages are.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, same thing for people who are socialized female, right? Like, it's just like a different story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. Round two of the conversation. Thanks so much for being a guest on the show, and it's been a great conversation. That's our show. Thanks for tuning in this week to Fully Exposed. I hope your ass has been sufficiently educated.
This has been an Evoke Media podcast.